Coming into terms with the death of a family member or a close friend poses a challenge to anyone. In such a time people ponder on the various mysteries of life and death in particular. Ancient and modern societies or religions have held varying opinions on life and death. The ancient religious traditions such as the Egyptians and Mesopotamians believed that the body unified with the soul after death. These cultures therefore embarked in body preservation such as mummification as a preparation for the journey in its afterlife. Nearly all cultures believe in life after death, which takes various forms such as reincarnations, and life in hell or heaven. Religion and culture play a vital role in solving the questions surrounding death and afterlife. One such mystery which could add a topic for the supporters of afterlife is this case of a boy named James Leininger. What happened to him? How was his body related to afterlife? Let's see in this video. Our story starts on April 10, 1998 in the city of Texas, USA, where two people, Bruce and Andrea, gave birth to a boy named James Leininger. A peculiar thing about James was that he was interested in aircrafts since his age of 2, where a person barely knows to speak. Yet, he used to play with plane models and see images of planes. One fine day, James was taken to a museum in Louisiana where there were displays of ships and planes used in World War II. And James had a great time there, to such an extent that he never wanted to go home. But somehow, his parents managed to take him home. And that day, he had a dream in which he died while he was flying an airplane, and even shook his hands and legs and shouted while sleeping as if the dream was real. And his parents left it thinking that it was normal, as children are known to get adventurous in fantasy-filled dreams. Over the next few weeks, James used to get the same dream repeatedly. But his parents ignored it. Days went smoothly. One day his mom showed him an image of a plane and told him, "Look, there is a bomb below the airplane." But James replied that is a drop tank, not a bomb. But his mother didn't know what a drop tank was.
"Oh look, there's a bomb on the bottom of it." He said, "That's not a bomb, Mama, that's a drop tank."
A drop tank?
I'd never heard of a drop tank. I didn't know what a drop tank was.
She looked up in the dictionary to find out what a drop tank was, but couldn't figure it out. But as soon as she asked an expert about it, she was shocked, because her son knew parts of old planes in a detailed manner. Obviously, the details could not be seen in the toys with which he used to play. While his family was pondering about this, James' grandma thought that James has thoughts on his previous life. But neither James' mom nor dad was ready to believe it. But in reality, his grandma was right. James was the rebirth of a World War II pilot. Not able to believe, right? But how did his parents come to such a conclusion? Well, one day when they asked James on how he felt during his dreams, James replied that when his fighter plane took off from a ship, he was attacked by the Japanese troops.
Bruce said, "What happened to your plane?" He said, "It crashed on fire." And Bruce said, "Why did your airplane crash?" And he said, "It got shot." And Bruce said, "Well, who shot your plane?" And I'll never forget the look on his face. He went, "The Japanese!"
James knew each and every part of fighter planes, though he had never seen one. And when his parents asked him the name of the pilot, here, James gave a shocking reply. The pilot of that plane too had the name James, but he was James Houston. But his parents left it thinking that it was just a coincidence. And when they asked him the name of the ship from which his fighter plane took off, James answered USS Natoma.
Another night, Bruce had come in and he said, "Do you remember where your plane took off?" And he said, "It took off of a boat." "Do you remember the name of your boat?" "Natoma."
In reality, a ship named USS Natoma had really existed. Still, his parents didn't believe much that he was a rebirth of a World War pilot and left him as it is. Days went by and James was interested in drawing like any other kid. But all his drawings were about planes. Moreover, he always gave his signature at the bottom of the paper. But he always wrote his signature as James 3 instead of James. And when his parents asked him why he wrote James 3, he replied that he was the third reincarnation of Pilot James. Along with this, James also loved to play with toys. And among his toys, there were 3 boy toys. And James named them as Leon, Billy, and Walter. But the shocking this was that nobody named Leon, Billy or Walter was known to his parents. When his parents asked him who they were, James replied that they were his friends whom he met in heaven. And when his parents asked him if he had any friends, James replied the name Jack Larson.
Do you remember what your name was? And he'd always say, James. His name is James. It never really occurred to us. We thought he just wasn't understanding the question. So I said, do you remember any friends or anyone else that you flew with? And he said, Jack Larson.
Suddenly, James spotted a book in their bookshelf named The Battle of Iwo Jima. While he was flipping through the pages seeing the pictures, in one particular page, he called his parents and pointed to the picture saying that that was the place where he died. And after all these incidents, his dad got slight belief in reincarnation. So, he contacted Natoma Bay Association to collect details. But he never mentioned about his son James and told them that the information he collects was to host a talk show. His dad then asked the association if there was somebody named Jack Larson and also gave a description about the place where his son pointed in the book. Surprisingly, both the place as well as someone named Jack Larson existed. But, he could not get any contact details about Jack Larson in the records of people who died in Natoma air disaster. The reason why Jack Larson was not there in the records of dead people was because he was still alive. But James's dad did not know this. In a few months, all members of the Natoma Air Force Base had a reunion. And James's dad Bruce also went there expecting to get some details. And as per his plan, Bruce met Jack Larson and asked him if he knew anything about Pilot James. And Jack replied that both of them were good friends. But until one day when both of them were on different planes and James's plane caught fire and blasted on spot. This resembled the dream his son James got. Before leaving, Jack Larson told Bruce that James Houston had a sister and gave Bruce her contact details, and when Bruce took his son James to Pilot James's sister, James called her Ann. In reality, James's sister's name was not Ann. But her family used to fondly called her Ann. In other words, Ann was the nickname of Pilot James' sister. This gave an immediate shock to everyone around. James also knew few personal details about Ann like her birthday, her properties and possessions etc. and told them one by one and each of them was also verified by Ann. After this, James went back home. In few days Ann sent a huge parcel to James. In the parcel were 2 astonishing images and information. The first one had an image of Pilot James on his last flight. The second one had an image of Pilot James with 3 of his friends, Leon, Billy, and Walter. Do you remember how he named his toys? And James named them as Leon, Billy, and Walter. Soon, his family went to a museum and both images were submitted there. Here, little James bumped onto someone and both of them started speaking. The person on whom he bumped was Rob, a man who worked with Pilot James Houston. Little James even recognized Rob by his face and voice as soon as he saw Rob. They spoke there for some time and James returned home. Weeks went by and finally James was taken to the place described in the book saying that to be the place where Pilot James was dead and paid his tribute to Pilot James. In a few months, James grew up and since James turned 10, his face showed a lot of resemblance to Pilot James. Look for yourself. Also, their names are same. Little James even recognized the people who were his sisters, friends and workmates in his previous life. Now, I am not going to ask you the same boring question again. I am not going to ask you if it is real or fake. My question to you guys is, if you had a chance to be the rebirth of some historical personality, who would be? Hitler? Alexander? Einstein? Confucius? Columbus? Or none of them? Let me know in the comments. I will see you in another video. Till then, goodbye.